As the debate over the next massive EU budget heats up, the European Court of Auditors, ECA, has just dropped its annual report. The headline sounds good. Overall, irregularities are going down. But if you dig just a little deeper, the ECA's findings reveal serious cracks in the foundation of the EU's financial system. There are two major threats to accountability. First, the massive debt mountain related to the next generation EU pandemic funding, which is absolutely soaring. And secondly, the persistingly high error rate in traditional EU spending. The European Court of Auditors President Tony Murphy stresses that these errors aren't always fraud, but they are money that was spent without following the rules. The ECA is now warning the EU that embracing the fast-track funding model used during the pandemic, a model that prioritizes speed over accountability, is a serious risk that must be addressed. Is the EU's changing finance structure sacrificing robust financial accountability for political speed? And with that, welcome to this episode of On Your Left, the news brief that looks behind the headlines on economic developments, politics, and trade union issues in and around Europe. My name is Felix Sassmannshausen. So let's unpack the core messages of the European Court of Auditors 2024 annual report. Its findings are out right in the middle of the heated political fight over the size and structure of the next multi-annual financial framework, the EU's 7-year budget blueprint for 2028 through 2034. ECA President Tony Murphy couldn't be clearer, saying this annual review offers important lessons, highlights key challenges, and emphasizes risks that should be considered when shaping future budgets. The Court of Auditors reviewed the EU's total revenue, which, including the money borrowed for the Next Generation EU Crisis Fund, was a staggering €250.6 billion. That is a huge amount. Just to make it a bit less abstract, this amount would cover the costs if you wanted to buy the latest top-of-the-line smartphone for every single one of the 450 million people living in the European Union. And you'd probably still have money left over. The good news is that the ECA gave a clean bill of health on the reliability of the accounts and the revenue collected. But the picture darkens when they looked at how the money was actually spent. Since the EU budget is split between the long-standing MFF funds and the Temporary Recovery and Resilience Facility, which uses a completely different way of distributing the money, the ECA had to issue two separate opinions on spending regularity. First, for traditional EU budget spending in the lines of the multi-annual financial framework, which is based on complex reimbursement-based rules, the ECA issued an adverse opinion for the 6th year in a row. This is a serious finding. The overall estimated error rate stood at 3.6%. This error is considered material and pervasive, meaning that non-compliance affects a substantial amount of the money spent. The errors typically involve things like ineligible costs or ineligible projects and breaches of public procurement rules. To give you a real-world example, the ECA found a project in France that was meant to build a biogas plant. The company running the project, though, failed to run the required competitive market consultation. Instead, they simply awarded the construction contract directly to another company owned by the same corporate group. This is a serious breach of the public procurement rules, which are supposed to ensure public money is spent economically, efficiently, and fairly. Second, for the Recovery and Resilience Facility, spending, which came to nearly €60 billion in 2024, the European Court of Auditors issued a qualified opinion. This means that while RRF funds are generally legal, the auditors found specific material deficiencies that are a cause for concern. The ECA report provides powerful evidence for those who want a fundamental overhaul of the EU budget structure in the upcoming long term budget negotiations. So let's look at the main 3 points of critique. First, the persistence of high risk errors. The highest error rates concentrate in the most complex spending areas. The parts of the budget subject to those complex reimbursement based rules, representing about 2/3 of the audited spending, had an estimated error rate of 5.2%. High risk areas include the cohesion policy, so spending for regional development, and external aid, so money spent in the EU neighborhood and around the world. The primary culprits remain the same: illegible costs and the failure to follow public procurement rules, leaving loopholes for conflicts of interest or even fraud. The second point of critique is the growing debt burden. The report flags the massive and growing next generation EU debt. By the end of 2027, the EU's outstanding borrowing is expected to exceed 900 billion euros, nearly 10 times the level before Next Generation EU began in 2020 in the course of the coronavirus pandemic. Just to put it into perspective, Germany has the biggest economy in the Eurozone. Its entire federal budget for 1 year, everything the German government spends on roads, defense, social security, everything, is around 450 billion euros. So, the new debt the EU is taking on is nearly double the entire annual spending of its largest and wealthiest economy. This borrowing has led to sharply increased financing costs. Total interest expenditure in the current budget period could surpass 30 billion euros, more than double the original forecast. Crucially, most of the repayment is deferred to future budgets. A significant chunk of the proposed 2028 to 2034 multi-annual financial framework is already allocated just to pay off this debt, limiting funds for any new initiatives. The third major concern is that the Recovery and Resilience Fund's funding model, meant as a temporary crisis measure, is now influencing future policy design. The Court of Auditors warned that proposals for the next MFF suggest implementing a model similar to the Recovery Fund. That model works by paying countries when they hit milestones or targets, not based on auditing the final costs of a project. Because the payments aren't conditional on compliance with cost rules at the final recipient level, issues like fraud and public procurement breaches are much harder to tackle systematically. The ECA found issues where milestones were not satisfactorily fulfilled. For example, in politically sensitive cases such as judicial reform connected to payments to Poland, the ECA found serious weaknesses in the appointment of judges. The Court of Auditors insists that future performance based instruments should only be employed when funding is directly linked to measurable results and that the design not compromise accountability. The European Commission, for its part, told me that they think this critique is somewhat polemic, so it doesn't seem that we will see a lot of movement in that regard. To sum it up and give some perspective, the European Court of Auditors report really exposes a trend where the EU's rush to implement its economic strategy and rapidly deploy capital often overrides strict democratic and financial accountability. The persistent error rate in traditional spending is simply unacceptable. Errors like ineligible costs and procurement breaches are a structural failure to ensure that money intended for social cohesion, regional development, and environmental compliance is managed rules based and effectively. While it was a good approach to take on common debt with the crisis model of the Recovery Fund, there's big room for reform here. Payments rewarded milestones instead of auditing the compliance of final expenditure, and that is the main problem the ECA finds. It fundamentally weakens the accountability chain, especially when funds are channeled into private companies. This approach favors the rapid injection of capital to meet political targets like the green and digital transitions or defense procurement, often prioritizing economic flexibility for powerful actors over strict adherence to labor and social standards at the local level. Additionally, the massive crisis debt, projected above 900 billion euros, is a significant fiscal burden deferred onto future generations. It is set to restrict the future EU's budget capacity to address urgent social and ecological investments if no other sources of income are generated. And while the EU Commission is suggesting new revenue streams like levies on emissions or tobacco, which are good ideas and welcomed across political institutions, a long term expansion of the funding basis for the EU is still lacking. And EU states seem to be reluctant to move in this direction. Without it, though, the necessary financial instruments to ensure social cohesion across the continent will sooner or later run short. Meanwhile, the European Parliament is right to insist that the next multi-annual financial framework must be subject to full parliamentary control and accountability, as they say, and reject any moves towards reducing legitimate democratic control. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts on the episode, please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments or send me a message. To stay up to date, subscribe to my newsletter, which is published every Tuesday, and I'd be delighted to receive steady or Substack subscriptions. My name is Felix Hassmannshausen. Until next week.